Okay, so this piece digs into the huge financial hit from floods on Australian homes, $42.2 billion in lost value, and how, failures in planning and climate adaptation are making inequality worse. Let's jump right into our first key observation. While the material gives us some really powerful evidence linking flood risk and housing devaluation, there's definitely a chance here to push that finding on structural divergence in housing wealth right to the forefront. Make it the main thesis.
Right.
I mean, the data you present is pretty staggering. You've got that median value difference, what is it, $75,000 for flood-prone homes?
Yeah.
And the total cost, that huge $42.2 billion figure, that's massive. And the analysis itself says, over time, this may lead to a structural divergence in housing wealth accumulation based on climate resilience.
It is clearly laid out. Yeah. The data hits you immediately. But I do wonder about the hierarchy of the argument, maybe?
How so?
Well, right now, that phrase, structural divergence, it kind of lands more like an academic conclusion, or maybe a long-term forecast that comes after you've already given the reader that huge $42.2 billion sticker shock.
That's a good point. It does feel like maybe the biggest potential story here, this creation of a permanent, climate resilience wealth divide, it's being treated as the result of the data.
Instead of the main lens?
Exactly.
Instead of the core idea through which we should be looking at all that data.
And is there maybe a risk that if we just focus purely on the dollar value right up front, we might sort of overlook the deeper systemic shift? What this divergence actually represents?
Yeah. If we lead with just the money, maybe we miss the really devastating long-term thing. And maybe we should clarify what we mean by structural divergence for everyone listening.
Good idea.
It's this idea that, over time, the actual geography of wealth, where value is held, it permanently shifts. And it shifts based on who can afford to get out of risky areas and who's forced to just take the loss.
Precisely. So the weakness we're seeing here is that this really powerful concept, structural divergence, it comes in quite late. It feels more like a significant finding at the end rather than the central organizing idea framing the whole story of loss and inequality.
Okay, so the recommendation for improvement seems pretty clear then. It's about recentering the narrative's angle, right?
Right.
We probably need to explore this widening wealth gap, the one created specifically by climate risk right from the get-go.
Use the data and the personal stories as the proof?
Exactly. Use the numbers and those really affecting personal accounts as proof points for this divergence that's happening, rather than, the other way around.
Okay, so how do we make that actionable? Right in the opening paragraphs, how could we restructure the start to really foreground this divergence idea?
Well, one pretty effective way could be to set up the dichotomy straight away. In the introduction.
Contrast things?
Yeah. Contrast the experience in those high-value suburbs that are already seeing prices adjust, like Chalmer. You mentioned it saw a $303,000 average impact. Now, that's a huge loss, no question.
Huge.
But for someone wealthy there, maybe they can absorb it, or they have the capital to just move, to escape. Contrast that with the experience of low-income families where, as the expert commentary pointed out, they often have no choice but to take on that risk.
Right, that's where the gap really opens up.
That's where the divergence takes root.
That contrast is so important because it really highlights the social consequence, doesn't it? Not just the financial number. It shows us that flood risk isn't just, bad luck from nature. It's becoming an economic filter.
And building on that, you could frame the personal stories you included, Warwick Irwin and Kate Smolders. Frame them not just as sort of sad stories of flood victims, but as early examples of this climate-driven housing market separation.
Ah, okay.
I mean, Irwin moving well above the flood level, that's the perfect illustration of escape, right? He had the means, maybe through a buyout or his own equity, to actually buy climate resilience.
Well, others don't have that option.
Exactly. That's immediately contrasted with others who are forced to stay, absorb the loss, watch their main asset devalue.
Okay, I see. By making that distinction the sort of center of gravity for the piece, you instantly raise the stakes.
Yeah.
And it might even be a simple headline change, or just shifting that opening paragraph to state the bigger argument up front, something like, the Australian housing market is splitting apart, creating a climate resilience wealth divide that's already cost homeowners $42.2 billion.
That puts the systemic failure, the long-term trend, ahead of just the immediate number. It gives the whole piece more lasting weight, I think.
It definitely sharpens the urgency. It shifts the story from, wow, floods cost a lot, to something more like, look how climate change is fundamentally rewriting who gets to hold wealth in Australia.
That's a much more powerful narrative, isn't it?
Absolutely. And okay, if the first issue is the structural wealth gap, the market splitting, that kind of naturally leads us to ask, well, who's letting this happen?
Right, who's responsible?
Which brings us squarely to the policy side of things and our second main critique.
Okay.
The critique of, quote, stupid planning decisions and the political failure to stand up to powerful lobby groups. That part is really compelling. But the solutions suggested for adaptation, they seem to lack the kind of structural specificity needed to actually counter these deep systemic problems you've identified.
Yeah, this section definitely has some fire in it, which is great. The expert commentary is incredibly strong here.
It is.
Citing how planning systems are struggling to cope, pointing to that infuriating example from South Australia where councils just chose to ignore their flood mapping.
Actively ignore it.
Actively, explicitly, to avoid harming development prospects.
And the call for political courage is absolutely spot on.
It really shows a complete breakdown in governance, doesn't it? When developers can apparently influence local councils to just disregard the science, the data, that's not just incompetence.
No. That sounds like regulatory capture, plain and simple.
Exactly. So that's the way of the problem we're dealing with. But then we look at the proposed solution that's mentioned, a robust adaptation plan. It includes infrastructure, levees, raised roads, and sort of general support for individual households.
Okay, yeah, I can see the mismatch there immediately. The weakness seems to be that this idea of a robust adaptation plan is just too general. Especially when the material itself details how political interests are actively undermining the existing tools like flood mapping. They're choosing to ignore the data. So just offering general funding for more infrastructure, it doesn't really tackle the core problem, does it?
Which is?
Which is the failure of governance, the lack of regulatory enforcement. You're basically asking for courage, but the solution offered is money for stuff, not rules with teeth.
Precisely. We've got to match the weight of the critique, this, profound political cowardice. The lobbying influence. We need policy suggestions that are equally robust. And they need to be specifically targeted at enforcing climate-informed land use decisions.
Right.
The focus really needs to shift, I think, from just funding adaptation measures to reforming who actually holds the power over development decisions in these risky areas.
That's a significant shift in focus, yeah. But it feels necessary, given the gravity of the problem you laid out. So, okay, let's get specific then. How do we deliver that structural specificity? How do we move beyond just suggesting more funding for levees?
Well, we have to challenge that local political inertia head-on, I think.
Okay.
So instead of just generalized infrastructure funding, maybe suggest specific governance reforms, ones that actually mandate compliance.
Like what?
For instance, maybe propose that state or even federal authorities impose mandatory, absolutely non-negotiable compliance with standardized flood mapping data.
Overriding local councils?
Overriding local council development permissions if they're in designated high-risk zones. That takes the political heat off the local councilors who we know are susceptible to those developer lobby groups.
That's highly actionable. And it forces accountability, doesn't it? It basically says, if you're going to call out regulatory failure, you have to propose a regulatory solution. Makes sense.
And maybe beyond just mandatory mapping, we need mechanisms that really institutionalize the true costs of this risk.
How?
We could suggest things like highly differentiated insurance mandates, maybe, or properly funded, government-backed managed retreat programs.
Okay, managed retreat. That's a term that might be new to some listeners, but it feels essential here. We're not just talking about people packing up and leaving on their own, right?
No, not at all. We're talking about organized, publicly supported programs, often involving government buybacks, like the kind that Warwick Irwin apparently benefited from in the story.
Right.
These programs provide a clear, financially viable way out of the highest risk areas.
It's like a structured exit strategy.
Exactly. Just offering generalized household support after a flood, that's reactive, it's temporary. Managed retreat, done properly, is a structural, long-term solution. It acknowledges that some areas are just permanently uninsurable or simply too risky to keep developing.
And it ties directly back to those buybacks you mentioned, ensuring the burden of that loss isn't solely on the individual homeowner.
Which, again, stops driving that wealth divergence we talked about earlier.
Right, it all connects. And finally, because the material was so good at pointing fingers at those powerful lobby groups,
Mm-hmm.
the solutions probably need to target them too. Yeah, we should maybe propose specific legislation, something aimed at increasing transparency around developer lobbying efforts, particularly concerning flood zones.
Yes, that feels like the necessary counterpoint. You identified a political problem, vested interests, basically subverting the planning process.
Yeah.
So your solution needs to include a political reform, like mandating transparency. That way, you ensure the proposed solutions are as sharp and focused and systemic as the problems you identified in the first place.
This is exactly what we mean by matching the weight of the critique with the specificity of the solution. The strength of the data and the narrative here really demands policy proposals that tackle the governance failures head-on, not just the infrastructure needs.
Agreed.
Okay, look, this has been a really insightful critique. It's working with fundamentally strong material that's hitting that critical point where climate risk, governance, and wealth inequality all intersect.
Yeah, and I think we identified two core opportunities for elevation that could really maximize the piece's impact. First, taking that excellent data and narrative and really transitioning it, elevating it, into a central thesis around structural wealth divergence, making that long-term social cost the absolute lead argument.
Right. Make the divergence the story, not just a finding. And second, making sure those policy solutions are specific enough, sharp enough to actually tackle the political and systematic planning inertia that the material highlighted so effectively, shifting that focus from just general funding towards mandatory governance reform and these structural market interventions like managed retreat.
So the actionable next steps feel pretty clear. First, center the whole argument on that climate resilience wealth divide. Really focus on the dichotomy: who can afford to escape the risk and who can't.
Use those contrasts.
Exactly. Then, introduce those specific governance or regulatory solutions, things like mandated flood map compliance, maybe mandatory lobby transparency solutions that actively push back against the political pressures that you've expertly identified in the piece.
Okay, great. Go make those revisions. We really enjoyed digging into this material, and we definitely welcome you to submit the revised work back again for another look in the future.